Daniel's hand cracked across Elizabeth's face before the tray even hit the ground. For 1 second, the whole backyard went silent. The paper plates stopped moving, the grill hissed behind them, lemonade spilled across the patio stones and soaked into Elizabeth's shoes. Daniel stepped closer, his jaw tight. "Don't you ever touch me again." Elizabeth pressed one hand to her cheek. "I didn't." "Clean this mess," he snapped, pointing at the drinks on the ground, "and get out." Everyone had seen it, her cousins, her aunt, her sister. But nobody moved. Then Melissa walked over, not to check Elizabeth's face, not to ask what happened, but to stand beside Daniel like he was the one who had been wronged. "Apologize to him," Melissa said. Elizabeth stared at her. "Melissa, he slapped me." Melissa's eyes hardened. "Apologize or leave." Elizabeth looked around the barbecue she had helped set up that morning. The folding tables, the trays of food, the decorations she had bought because Melissa said money was tight again. Her throat tightened, but her voice came out steady. "No." A few people looked down. Someone quietly picked up a cup. Daniel gave a short, satisfied laugh like her refusal proved something. Melissa stepped aside and pointed toward the gate. "Then leave." Elizabeth walked through the backyard while her cheek burned and her hands shook. Behind her, Daniel muttered, always playing innocent. Nobody followed her. At her car, Elizabeth fumbled for her keys. Her phone buzzed once in her pocket. A notification flashed across the screen. Harper and Lois State Attorneys, urgent call requested. She barely saw it through the tears she refused to let fall. Inside the yard, the barbecue slowly started again. Chairs scraped. Someone forced a laugh. Daniel's voice rose above the others, calm now, confident again. Elizabeth sat behind the steering wheel, staring at the house where her own sister had just chosen a man's pride over her bleeding cheek. And she had no idea that within hours, Daniel and Melissa would return home to find something waiting at their front door that would make every person at that barbecue regret staying silent. Elizabeth drove without turning on the radio. The silence inside the car was almost louder than the slap. Every time she stopped at a traffic light, she caught a glimpse of the faint red mark on her cheek in the rearview mirror. She touched it once, then quickly lowered her hand. "I didn't even do anything," she whispered to herself. Her phone buzzed again. This time she ignored it. By the time she reached her small townhouse, the anger had faded into something heavier. Exhaustion. She walked inside, placed her keys on the kitchen counter, and leaned against it. Her eyes drifted toward a framed photograph sitting beside the coffee maker. It showed her, Melissa, and their grandfather smiling in his garden years earlier. Back then, Melissa used to wrap an arm around Elizabeth's shoulders and call her my favorite little sister. Elizabeth smiled sadly. So much for that. She sank into a chair. The memories came one after another. Not because she wanted them to, but because she couldn't stop them. When Melissa had returned to work after her first child was born, Elizabeth had watched the baby almost every afternoon for nearly a year. "I don't know what we'd do without you," Melissa had said countless times. Elizabeth never accepted payment. She simply loved spending time with her niece. Years later, when Daniel lost his job for several months, Elizabeth quietly paid 2 overdue utility bills after Melissa called her crying. "No one can know," Melissa had begged. "They won't," Elizabeth promised. She never mentioned it again. Then there were birthdays, Christmas dinners, family reunions. If decorations needed hanging, Elizabeth arrived early. If someone forgot dessert, Elizabeth drove across town to buy one. If Grandpa needed a ride to a doctor's appointment, Elizabeth cancelled her own plans without hesitation. She had become the family member everyone relied on. And somehow, the easiest one to overlook. Daniel's insults hadn't started at the barbecue. They had started years ago. Small comments, tiny cuts disguised as jokes. "You still single? You work too much. You always try too hard." Whenever Elizabeth spoke during family dinners, Daniel somehow found a way to interrupt her. Melissa usually laughed. "Oh, that's just Daniel." If Elizabeth looked uncomfortable, Melissa would shrug. "You know how he is." Over time, everyone else began doing the same. Daniel's disrespect slowly became normal. Not because it was acceptable, but because nobody wanted to challenge him. Elizabeth remembered another family gathering nearly a year earlier. She had accidentally parked in Daniel's favorite spot near the driveway. He walked into the house carrying his cooler and loudly announced, "Guess some people still don't understand basic manners." Everyone laughed. Elizabeth quietly moved her car. Not one person told Daniel he was being unreasonable. She had convinced herself keeping the peace was worth swallowing her pride. Today proved she had been wrong. Her phone vibrated for the third time. This time she picked it up. One new voicemail. She pressed play. "Good afternoon, Miss Carter. This is Michael Harper from Harper & Lowe Estate Attorneys. Please return my call as soon as possible regarding the occupancy agreement connected to your grandfather's estate. This matter requires your immediate attention." The message ended. Elizabeth frowned. She had been hoping she wouldn't have to think about any of that today. Not after what had happened. She rubbed her forehead and stared at the phone for nearly a full minute. Family conflict was the last thing she wanted. But something inside her had changed. Not because of the slap alone. Because of Melissa. Because her own sister had looked into her eyes and chosen humiliation over truth. Elizabeth finally pressed the call button. The attorney answered almost immediately. "Miss Carter, thank you for calling. I received your voicemail. I'm sorry it comes at such a difficult time." There was a brief pause. "Has something happened?" Elizabeth let out a slow breath. "Yes, I see." His tone became more careful. "As I explained when your grandfather's estate was finalized, the occupancy agreement protecting your sister and her husband also included conditions. I remember. One of those conditions specifically addressed harassment, intimidation, or abusive conduct directed toward you." Elizabeth closed her eyes. "I remember. If those conditions were violated, you are under no obligation to continue allowing them to occupy the property." She remained silent. The attorney didn't pressure her. Finally, Elizabeth asked the only question that mattered. "If I decide today, can everything be done legally?" Without hesitation, he answered, "Yes." Another long silence followed. Elizabeth looked once more at the fading mark on her cheek. Then she spoke. "Please move forward." The attorney answered quietly, "I'll begin immediately." The call ended. Elizabeth slowly set her phone down. For the first time all day, she wasn't running from the conflict anymore. She had made a decision. One that could never be undone. Someone turned the burgers on the grill. Children chased each other across the lawn as if nothing had happened. Only the adults seemed uneasy. Daniel stood near the cooler with a soda in one hand, laughing loudly. "I'm telling you," he said, shaking his head, "she's always been dramatic. She barely brushed me and acted like I was the problem." A couple of cousins exchanged uncomfortable glances but said nothing. Daniel continued, "Some people need to learn boundaries. She did this to herself." Melissa nodded beside him. "Exactly, she could have apologized, but she's too stubborn." An awkward silence settled over the group. Finally, Aunt Carol folded her arms. "Daniel," she said carefully, "I watched what happened." He looked at her. "So did everyone else. You slapped her." Daniel shrugged. "And..." Carol frowned. She was carrying drinks. Someone bumped into her. Daniel scoffed. "You didn't see it from my angle." "I saw enough." Melissa stepped forward before Carol could continue. "My husband doesn't owe anyone an explanation." Carol looked directly at her niece. Your sister walked out of here with a handprint on her face. Melissa crossed her arms. And she could have avoided all of this by apologizing. Several relatives looked away. No one wanted another argument. Daniel smiled confidently. See, even Melissa understands. Across the yard, whispers quietly began spreading. I've never seen him hit anyone before. That wasn't self-defense. Elizabeth didn't deserve that. A few family members discreetly pulled out their phones. One cousin sent Elizabeth a message. Are you okay? Another wrote, I'm sorry nobody stopped him. An older uncle quietly muttered to his wife, we should have said something. She nodded. We should have. For the first time all afternoon, Daniel noticed the atmosphere shifting. People weren't laughing with him anymore. They were simply waiting for the barbecue to end. An hour later, guests began gathering their things. There were polite goodbyes, but none of the warmth that usually followed family gatherings. Daniel noticed. What is everybody so quiet about? Nobody answered. Melissa forced a smile. They're just tired. Daniel believed her. As they loaded coolers into the SUV, he smirked. I guarantee Elizabeth will call tomorrow pretending none of this happened. Melissa sighed. She always comes around. Exactly. He slammed the tailgate shut. People like her never stay mad. They climbed into the vehicle and drove home, convinced the day had ended exactly as Daniel wanted. 20 minutes later, Daniel turned onto their street. He slowed the SUV. What's going on? Melissa leaned forward. There was a white sedan parked in front of their house. Behind it sat another unfamiliar vehicle. Standing near the front walkway were 3 people. A man wearing a tailored navy suit held a leather briefcase. Beside him stood a uniformed locksmith with a toolbox resting on the sidewalk. A third person, dressed as a legal courier, held a large sealed envelope. Melissa frowned. Are they at the wrong house? Daniel laughed. They must be. He parked in the driveway and climbed out confidently. Can I help you? He asked. The suited man smiled politely. Good afternoon. He removed a business card from his pocket. My name is Michael Harper. He paused. I'm an attorney representing the owner of this property. Daniel frowned. The owner? Yes. Melissa looked confused. There has to be some mistake. The attorney glanced at both of them. Before we proceed, may I confirm your identities? Daniel folded his arms. I'm Daniel Brooks. And I'm Melissa Brooks. The attorney nodded once. Thank you. He accepted the sealed envelope from the courier and handed it directly to Daniel. Daniel looked down. His expression changed. Elizabeth's name appeared prominently across the first page. His confident smile faded. What is this? The attorney met his eyes without raising his voice. Before you enter this house. He gestured toward the envelope. You need to read page 1. Daniel tore open the envelope with impatient hands. This is ridiculous, he muttered, some kind of clerical error. Melissa stepped closer, trying to read over his shoulder. The attorney remained calm, saying nothing. The first page was headed in bold letters. Daniel frowned. What occupancy agreement? He flipped to the next page. His eyes stopped moving. The color slowly drained from his face. Melissa reached for the papers. Daniel, what is it? He didn't answer. She took the documents from his hands. The very first paragraph read, The legal owner of the property is Elizabeth Carter, pursuant to the final probate order and recorded deed executed following the estate of Harold Carter. Melissa stared at the words. No. She turned another page. No, this can't be right. The attorney finally spoke. There is no mistake. Daniel looked up angrily. My wife inherited this house from her grandfather. No, the attorney replied evenly. Your grandfather transferred ownership to Miss Elizabeth Carter. The deed was properly recorded several months ago. That's impossible. It is fully documented. The attorney opened his briefcase and removed certified copies. There is the recorded deed. He placed one document on top of the envelope. There is the probate order. Another document followed. And here is the occupancy agreement signed after the transfer. Melissa slowly recognized her grandfather's signature. So did Daniel. Neither could deny it. Melissa's breathing became uneven. I remember. The memory came rushing back. A few months earlier, Grandpa had asked Elizabeth to drive him to several appointments. Daniel had joked about it. There goes Grandpa's favorite. Elizabeth had simply smiled and said nothing. Another memory followed. Grandpa had once asked everyone to leave the room, except Elizabeth during a family gathering. Melissa had assumed they were discussing medical paperwork. She had never asked another question. Now every small moment suddenly made sense. Elizabeth hadn't been hiding something out of spite. She had simply respected her grandfather's privacy. Daniel slammed the papers shut. I don't care whose name is on a piece of paper. We live here. We've lived here for years. You can't throw people out like this. The attorney nodded. Ordinarily, occupancy agreements remain in effect until their stated expiration. Daniel smirked. There you go. But the attorney continued, this agreement contains several conditions. He turned to a highlighted section. Condition 7. Melissa read aloud with trembling lips. Occupancy shall immediately terminate in the event of verified harassment, intimidation, physical violence or abusive conduct directed toward Elizabeth Carter. She stopped reading. Daniel grabbed the papers again. This doesn't prove anything. The attorney calmly replied. It does when supported by evidence. Daniel folded his arms. What evidence? The incident that occurred earlier today. Daniel laughed. You weren't there. No, but numerous witnesses were. The attorney handed him another folder. Inside were written statements collected that afternoon from family members who had contacted Elizabeth after learning she intended to enforce the agreement. Aunt Carol, Uncle Robert, 2 cousins, even Daniel's own younger brother. Every statement described the same thing. Elizabeth accidentally brushed against Daniel. Daniel slapped her. Melissa demanded Elizabeth apologize or leave. No one claimed Elizabeth had acted aggressively. Daniel's smile disappeared. This is unbelievable, he snapped. He pulled out his phone. I'm calling everybody. He immediately dialed Uncle Robert. Tell this lawyer he's wrong. Robert's voice remained calm. I'm not lying for you, Daniel. The line went dead. He called another cousin. No answer. Then Aunt Carol. She answered immediately. You hit her, Daniel. I saw it. I'm not defending you. She hung up. One by one, every call ended the same way. Some didn't answer. Those who did refused to support him. The people who had remained silent at the barbecue had finally found their voices. Melissa slowly lowered herself onto the front steps. Tears filled her eyes. I told her to leave. She whispered. The memory replayed in her mind. Elizabeth standing alone. Her cheek bright red. Looking at her own sister for help. Receiving none. Melissa buried her face in her hands. What have I done? The attorney looked at her sympathetically. Miss Carter made no threats. She simply instructed our office to enforce the agreement that already existed. Daniel stared at the house. For the first time, it no longer felt like his. It felt like someone else's property. Because legally, it was it. He turned toward the front door. I don't care. I'm going inside. He took one step toward the entrance. Before he could reach the porch, the locksmith quietly walked forward, inserted a new cylinder into the front door, and began replacing the lock. The metallic click echoed through the silent evening. Daniel stopped where he stood. For the first time all day, he had absolutely nothing left to say. The sound of the locksmith's tools echoed across the quiet street. Daniel stood frozen on the walkway, staring at the front door as though refusing to blink might somehow change what was happening. It doesn't matter, he finally snapped. Elizabeth can't just decide to ruin our lives because of one argument. The attorney closed his briefcase before answering. This decision wasn't made because of one argument. It was made because the agreement your grandfather created anticipated exactly this kind of behavior. Melissa slowly lifted her head. What do you mean? The attorney removed one final folder. Your grandfather asked our firm to explain the reasoning only if the occupancy agreement ever had to be enforced. He opened the document. Mr. Harold Carter believed Elizabeth would eventually inherit this property because she consistently cared for him during the final years of his life without asking for anything in return. Melissa looked down. The attorney continued. She drove him to every medical appointment. She managed his medications. She handled repairs around the house. She spent holidays with him when everyone else claimed to be too busy. Daniel remained silent. The attorney wasn't finished. Your grandfather also wanted both of you to have time to become financially stable. That's why he created a temporary occupancy agreement instead of requiring you to move immediately. Melissa's voice trembled. He was trying to help us. Yes, but he included one condition he considered non-negotiable. The attorney looked directly at Daniel. He told us he had witnessed your temper more than once. He specifically instructed us that if Elizabeth were ever threatened, intimidated, or physically harmed by either occupant, the agreement would end immediately. Melissa covered her mouth. So Grandpa expected this. He hoped it would never happen, the attorney replied quietly. But he prepared for the possibility. For several long moments, nobody spoke. Daniel's shoulders slowly dropped. The confidence he had carried all afternoon was gone. He wasn't angry anymore. He looked defeated. I never thought she'd actually do this. The attorney corrected him gently. She didn't. You did. Daniel frowned. What? You chose your actions this afternoon. Miss Carter simply exercised a legal right she already possessed. Those words settled over the driveway with undeniable weight. Daniel had spent years believing there would never be consequences. Today proved otherwise. Melissa wiped away her tears. I need to talk to Elizabeth. The attorney nodded. That decision is entirely hers. Melissa pulled out her phone with shaking hands. She stared at her sister's name for nearly a minute before pressing call. It rang, then went to voicemail. Melissa swallowed hard. Elizabeth. Her voice cracked. I'm so sorry. I should have stood beside you. I should have stopped him. I kept choosing peace with my husband instead of doing what was right. She paused, fighting tears. You deserved a sister today. I wasn't one. She ended the message without expecting a reply. Deep down, she knew apologies couldn't erase what had happened. Over the following week, Daniel and Melissa packed their belongings under the timeline outlined in the legal notice. There were no dramatic confrontations, no courtroom battles. Everything proceeded exactly as the agreement required. Word spread quickly through the family. Relatives who had witnessed the barbecue began calling Elizabeth one after another. Aunt Carol apologized for not speaking sooner. Uncle Robert admitted he regretted staying silent to avoid conflict. Several cousins confessed they had always been uncomfortable with Daniel's behavior, but never challenged him. Elizabeth accepted their apologies politely. She didn't lecture anyone. She simply thanked those who chose honesty. As for Daniel, invitations to family gatherings became noticeably fewer. People no longer laughed at his cutting remarks. The image of him striking Elizabeth in front of everyone had changed the way they saw him. The authority he once enjoyed disappeared, not because Elizabeth sought revenge, but because the truth had finally caught up with him. A month later, Elizabeth unlocked the front door of the house her grandfather had entrusted to her. She didn't rush to erase the past. Instead, she honored it. She repaired the worn porch railing her grandfather had always meant to fix. She planted fresh flowers in the front garden where he used to spend his mornings. Inside, she repainted the walls in warm colors he had once talked about choosing. For the first time, the house felt peaceful. Not because it was empty, because it was free from fear. Elizabeth also stopped saying yes to every request that came her way. She no longer believed that earning love meant sacrificing her dignity. If someone respected her, she gladly helped. If they didn't, she walked away. Without guilt. By the end of summer, Elizabeth invited a small group of relatives to a barbecue in the same backyard. This gathering looked nothing like the one she had left weeks earlier. People laughed without mocking anyone. Children ran through the grass. Conversations felt easy. Respect replaced tension. As the sun began to set, Aunt Carol handed Elizabeth a plate of grilled vegetables and smiled. "Your grandfather would have been proud." Elizabeth looked around the yard. At the flowers. At the family members who had chosen kindness. At the home her grandfather had trusted her to protect. Then she smiled quietly. Walking away from that barbecue hadn't been the moment she lost her family. It had been the moment she finally stopped, accepting a version of family that demanded her silence. And in choosing her self-respect, she gained the peaceful life her grandfather had always hoped she would have.